The first thing Corporal Danny Hayes noticed wasn't the sound, it was the silence. The usual hum of the Calari outpost had died somewhere in the last 30 seconds, replaced by a void that made his skin prickle. He raised his fist, and the 4 Marines behind him froze mid-step. Frost clung to the purple-tinted walls of the settlement, catching the light of the binary stars overhead. The air smelled wrong, metallic and sharp. "Miller, you getting anything?" Hayes whispered into his comm. Private First Class Tom Miller scanned the heat signature display on his wrist. His jaw tightened. "Negative on Calari life signs in the East Quarter. Should be at least 20 thermal readings there." "Should be," Hayes repeated. His rifle came up smooth, muscle memory taking over. "Positions?" Lance Corporal Ana Rodriguez moved left without a word, her boots silent on the frozen ground. Private Jesse O'Brien took right, and Private Bobby Tran covered their 6. Miller stayed on Hayes, both men moving forward in practice tandem toward the central courtyard, where the Calari had been preparing their evening meal cycle. The outpost was small, 18 structures arranged in concentric circles around a communal space. The Calari were farmers, merchants, families. They'd been here for 3 generations, scratching out a life on this ice ball of a moon, while their homeworld burned in the civil war that had consumed their species. The ones here wanted no part of it. They'd asked Earth for protection 6 months ago, and the Colonial Marines had sent 2nd Platoon, Charlie Company. Hayes had been walking these rounds for 163 days. He'd never heard silence like this. The courtyard opened before them, and Hayes's stomach dropped. Bodies. Calari bodies, their 4-armed forms crumpled in positions that spoke of panic of running. Their blue skin markings had faded to gray. No blood, the cold had frozen everything solid. "Contact?" Rodriguez's voice cracked through the comm half a second before the plasma rounds lit up the twilight. Hayes threw himself behind a storage container as superheated bolts chewed through the structure behind him. The distinctive whine of Rathic weapons filled the air, and Hayes felt his blood turn to ice that had nothing to do with the temperature. The Rathic Dominion. The other side of the Calari Civil War, the faction that considered any Calari who fled to be traitors worthy of execution. Intel said they were 3 systems away. Intel was wrong. "Fall back to the command post," Hayes shouted. "Protect the survivors." A Rathic warrior rounded the corner, its 6 legs moving in horrifying coordination, mandibles spread wide in a threat display. Miller put 3 rounds through its thorax before it could fire, and the creature went down thrashing. But there were more, so many more. Hayes sprinted across the courtyard as plasma fire turned the ground into glass behind him. His HUD showed Calari signatures in the command post, 12, maybe 15. Alive. He had to get there. O'Brien took a hit in the shoulder, the impact spinning him around. He went down hard but came up firing, his offhand working his rifle like he'd trained his whole life for this exact moment. "I'm good," O'Brien grunted. "Keep moving." The command post was a reinforced structure at the outpost center, designed to withstand everything from ice storms to meteor strikes. The door was sealed, but Hayes could see terrified Calari faces pressed against the narrow windows. He slammed his palm against the access panel. "Friendly." "Open up." The door slid open, and a young Calari, barely an adult, stood there with all 4 hands shaking. Hayes pushed past, scanning the interior. 15 Calari, all civilians, children, elders. The ones too scared or too slow to run when the attack began. "How many hostiles?" Rodriguez was at his shoulder, her rifle trained on the door. 36 and counting, Miller said, his scanner painting the tactical picture that made Hayes's throat tighten. "They're surrounding us." Tran appeared in the doorway, half dragging O'Brien. Blood-stained O'Brien's armor black, but the private was still conscious, still fighting. Tran sealed the door behind them and immediately started setting charges. "Bobby, what are you doing?" Hayes demanded. Tran didn't look up from his work. "Making sure if they get through, they don't get through easy." A Calari elder approached Hayes, her skin markings pulsing into stress patterns. Her translator rendered her whistling speech into flat English. "We are trapped. We will die here." Hayes met her 4 eyes, each one reflecting the same terrible understanding. He'd seen enough combat to know the math. 36 Rathic warriors against 5 Marines and 15 unarmed civilians. No backup. They were 2 hours from the main base, and the communication array had gone dark the moment the attack started. But he also knew what the Corps taught him, what every Marine learned before they ever set foot off Earth. You don't abandon the mission. You don't abandon civilians. You fight until you can't fight anymore, and then you fight some more. Ma'am, Hayes said, checking his ammunition counter, we're not dead yet. The first assault came 3 minutes later. The Rathic hit the door with shaped charges, blowing it inward in a shower of metal fragments. Tran's charges detonated a heartbeat later, and the Rathic warriors in the breach simply ceased to exist. But more came. Hayes fired in controlled bursts, each shot dropping a Rathic as they tried to push through the choke point. Beside him, Rodriguez worked her rifle like an extension of her body, calm and precise. Miller covered the windows, picking off Rathic trying to flank. O'Brien sat against the wall, one arm useless, the other firing his sidearm with grim determination. Magazine, Rodriguez called. Hayes kept firing while she reloaded, then switched as she came back up. The rhythm was automatic, drilled into them through hundreds of hours of training. The Rathic kept coming, kept dying, and Hayes knew they were trading bullets for time. Tran moved among the civilians, herding them toward the back of the command post where the walls were thickest. A Caleri child, no higher than Hayes's knee, clutched at the private's armor with two of its small hands. Tran gave it a gentle push toward its parent. Stay low, Tran said. Stay quiet. The Rathic changed tactics. Plasma fire stopped, replaced by the hiss of gas grenades through the broken doorway. Hayes's suit sensors screamed warnings, neurotoxin, lethal to Caleri in seconds, debilitating to humans in minutes. Seal your suits, Hayes ordered, his helmet snapping into place automatically. But the Caleri had no suits, no protection. They began to collapse, their skin markings flickering erratically. O'Brien pushed himself to his feet, swaying. Before anyone could stop him, he lurched to the environmental controls and slammed his fist against the emergency purge. The command post's atmosphere vented in a violent rush, pulling the gas out through every crack and opening. It also pulled the temperature down to ambient. The Caleri began to freeze almost immediately. Hayes saw the horror in their eyes as their bodies locked up, as the cold that was natural to this moon but fatal to them seeped into their flesh. They were dying, but they weren't choking anymore. Bobby, the stasis pods, Miller shouted, pointing to the emergency equipment along the wall. Medical stasis pods, designed for trauma cases, insulated and self-powered. Tran was already moving. He grabbed the nearest Caleri and shoved it into a pod, slapping the activation control. The pod hummed to life, its internal temperature stabilizing, medical systems engaging. One saved. 14 to go, 6 pods. Hayes made the calculation in the space between heartbeats. He grabbed 2 Caleri children and forced them into a single pod, overriding the safety protocols. Miller did the same. Rodriguez and Tran worked like machines, grabbing Caleri, sealing them in, moving to the next. The Rathic started their assault again, this time with cutters slicing through the walls. Hayes fired through the growing holes, bought seconds that felt like hours. His ammunition counter ticked down, 42 rounds, 36, 28. O'Brien collapsed, his suit compromised by his earlier wound, the neurotoxin finally working its way through his system. He hit the floor hard and didn't get up. Hayes wanted to go to him, wanted to check vitals, but there were still Caleri outside the pods, still dying. Last one, Rodriguez shouted, sealing a pod containing 3 Caleri pressed together like sardines. 9 survivors, it would have to be enough. The wall came down in sections, and Rathic warriors poured through. Hayes dropped his rifle empty and drew his sidearm. He put rounds into the nearest warrior's face, saw it fall, turned to the next. Beside him, Miller fought with his combat knife, the blade finding joints in Rathic armor with surgical precision. Rodriguez took a plasma bolt to the chest. Her armor held, but the impact threw her into the wall hard enough that Hayes heard bones break. She slid down, tried to raise her weapon, couldn't. A Rathic warrior approached her, and Hayes shot it 3 times before his sidearm clicked empty. Tran appeared from nowhere, tackling the next Rathic with nothing but his bare hands and the explosive charges still strapped to his chest. He looked back at Hayes, and their eyes met through their helmets. Tran smiled. The explosion took out 6 Rathic and blew a hole in the command post large enough to see stars. The shockwave knocked Hayes off his feet. He rolled, came up, found Miller's knife on the ground where the private had dropped it. His ears were ringing, his HUD was cracked and flickering, but his hands still worked. A Rathic warrior loomed over him. Hayes drove the knife up through its mandibles and into whatever passed for its brain. It thrashed, died, fell on top of him with crushing weight. He couldn't get free. Through the gaps in the Rathic's armor, Hayes could see Miller. The private was on his knees, surrounded, still fighting with a piece of shrapnel in each hand. He killed 2 more Rathic before they buried him under their numbers. Rodriguez wasn't moving. O'Brien wasn't moving. Tran was just gone, vapor and carbon. Hayes pushed against the dead Rathic, managed to shift it enough to breathe. A warrior approached, its plasma rifle trained on his helmet. He could see its eyes, cold, alien, utterly certain of its victory. The shot never came. The Rathic warrior's head exploded, and then the one behind it and the one behind that. The distinctive crack of human railguns filled the air, and Hayes realized the stasis pods were emitting a distress signal strong enough to punch through the jamming. Help had arrived, but far too late for his squad. The Rathic retreated under withering fire from the quick reaction force. Hayes lay under his dead enemy and watched the rescue unfold through dying eyes. They pulled the Caleri from the stasis pods first, proper protocol, civilians before soldiers. 9 survivors, stumbling and confused but alive. Captain Sarah Morrison reached him last. She pushed the Rathic corpse off him and pulled his helmet free. Her face swam in his vision. Hayes tried to form words. Tried to tell her about Miller's courage, O'Brien's sacrifice, Rodriguez's precision, Tran's smile. Tried to tell her that they'd done their job, saved who they could, fought to the last. But his lungs didn't work anymore. The neurotoxin had finally won. The last thing Danny Hayes saw was the stars overhead, cold and distant and uncaring. He thought of Earth, of a home he'd never see again, of the price paid in frozen ground on a forgotten moon. He thought it was too high a price, but then again he'd never been asked to set the value. Someone else would do that. Captain Jennifer Blake stood in the briefing room at Firebase Titan and watched the Caleri survivors tell their story. Her hands were clasped behind her back, regulation posture, but her knuckles were white enough to hurt. The Caleri elder spoke through her translator, each word precise and clear. She described the attack, the Marines' defense, the moments when death seemed certain until 5 humans decided otherwise. She named Hayes, Miller, Rodriguez, O'Brien, and Tran. She made sure every Marine in the room heard those names, understood those sacrifices. When she finished, the briefing room was silent. Blake looked at the faces around her. 2nd Platoon had lost its 2nd squad. 5 good Marines, 5 friends, 5 brothers and sisters who'd volunteered to walk patrol on a frozen moon because someone needed to. The rest of the platoon sat rigid in their chairs, and Blake could see the grief warring with rage on every face. Staff Sergeant Raymond Price broke the silence. "Ma'am, what's the operational response?" Blake had known the question was coming. She'd spent the last 6 hours in communication with regimental command, with colonial administration, with every layer of bureaucracy that separated decision from action. They told her to hold position, to wait for orders, to let the diplomats handle the Rathic Dominion. She'd nodded and said yes, sir, and meant none of it. "The Caleri have provided coordinates for the Rathic staging base," Blake said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "It's a hardened facility on the moon's dark side, approximately 200 kilometers from here. Intelligence estimates 30 to 40 remaining Rathic fighters, plus command and support personnel." Sergeant Lisa Park leaned forward. "Rules of engagement," Blake met her eyes. There was a settlement on Outpost 7. 33 Caleri civilians, all registered refugees under Earth protection. The Rathic Dominion violated colonial space, murdered civilians under our protection, and killed 5 colonial Marines performing their lawful duty. She paused, letting her words sink in. "The rules of engagement are simple. No quarter, no prisoners, no survivors." The briefing room erupted, not in objection, in approval. Marines stood, voices raised in a war cry that had echoed across 100 worlds. Blake let it run for 10 seconds, then raised her hand. Instant silence. "1st and 3rd squads will assault the facility. I'll be leading personally. We move in 2 hours, fast and light. The Rathic think they won. They think they can strike at human protectorates without consequence. They think we're soft, that we'll protest and file complaints and do nothing." Blake's voice dropped to something cold and hard. "We're going to teach them different." The assault force loaded into the 2 remaining APCs under the light of the binary stars. Blake rode in the lead vehicle, watching her Marines check weapons and equipment with the calm focus of professionals preparing for violence. These weren't fresh recruits. They were veterans of the frontier wars, men and women who'd seen combat on a dozen worlds. But this was different. This was personal. The APCs raced across the frozen landscape, their treads throwing up plumes of ice crystals that glittered like diamonds in the starlight. Blake monitored the tactical display, watching the target coordinates grow closer. No stealth approach this time. They were coming in fast and loud, and the Rathic would know they were coming. 2 minutes, the driver called back. Blake stood, grabbing the overhead rail. Around her, Marines rose as one, checking final gear. She saw Price adjusting his helmet, Park testing her rifle's action, Corporal David Green flexing his hands in his gloves. Good Marines, all of them. Marines who'd trained with Hayes and the others, who'd shared meals and stories and the thousand small moments that built a unit into a family. "Listen up," Blake said. The APC's interior went quiet. "The Rathic murdered our friends. They murdered civilians we swore to protect. They think that's acceptable. They think they can hit us and fade back into the dark, that there won't be consequences." She chambered around in her rifle, the sound sharp and final. "We are the consequences." The APCs crashed through the Rathic perimeter fence at full speed, their armored hulls scattering defensive barriers like toys. Blake hit the ramp release before they'd fully stopped, and First Squad poured out into the kill zone with her in the lead. The Rathic facility was built into a crater wall, multi-level structures, connected by exposed walkways. Defensive positions covered the approaches, or they had, before 24 Marines opened fire simultaneously. Blake's first shot took a Rathic gunner in the thorax, her second dropped its replacement. Around her, Marines advanced in textbook formation, every shot finding a target, every target dropping. The Rathic tried to rally. Warriors emerged from the structures, plasma rifles blazing. They were met with overwhelming firepower, precision marksmanship, and the raw fury of humans who'd lost their own. Blake watched Price take out 3 Rathic in as many seconds, watched Park clear a walkway with a grenade that sent bodies tumbling into the crater below. "First Squad, secure the lower levels. Third Squad with me." Blake led the assault on the main structure, breaching the entrance with shaped charges that turned the door into shrapnel. The interior was a warren of corridors and chambers, and the Rathic fought for every meter. Blake moved through it like a scythe through wheat, measured, efficient, deadly. Her rifle bucked in her hands, spent casings tinkling on the metal floor, and Rathic died. A warrior charged from a side corridor, mandibles spread wide. Blake's sidestep let it pass, put 3 rounds through its spine. It went down thrashing. She stepped over it and kept moving. Third Squad cleared rooms with brutal efficiency, their training meshing perfectly with their rage. Blake heard the crack of rifles, the screams of Rathic, the sharp commands of squad leaders keeping their people focused. This wasn't a battle, it was an execution, systematic and complete. She found the command center on the 3rd level, its walls covered in tactical displays showing the attack on Outpost 7. Blake stood for one moment, watching the playback of her Marines dying, and felt something cold and terrible settle in her chest. A Rathic officer stood before a console, its markings indicating high rank. It raised its weapon, but Blake was faster. She shot it in each leg joint, watched it collapse. Then she shot its weapon hand, watched it scrabble uselessly at the floor. "You killed my Marines," Blake said quietly. "You murdered civilians." The Rathic's translator rendered its clicking speech. "All traitors." Blake emptied her magazine into its face. The facility fell in 18 minutes. Blake stood in the crater as her Marines dragged Rathic bodies out of the structures and stacked them in the center of the compound. 42 Rathic dead, 0 survivors, 0 prisoners. Price approached, his armor scorched and dented, but his posture straight. "Facility secured, ma'am. No casualties." Blake nodded, looking at the bodies. Somewhere in that pile were the warriors who'd killed Hayes' squad, who'd murdered Caleri civilians, who'd thought they could strike with impunity. They'd learned otherwise, but the lesson had come too late for them to appreciate it. "Set demolition charges," Blake ordered. "I want this place erased." Park and her team wired the facility with enough explosives to turn the entire crater into a smoking hole. Blake watched from the APC as they worked, professional and thorough. When they were clear, she triggered the detonation herself. The explosion lit up the dark side of the moon like a newborn star. The shockwave rattled the APC's hull, and when the light faded, the Rathic facility was simply gone, replaced by molten rock and twisted metal still glowing red in the frozen air. Blake watched it burn and felt nothing. The ride back to Firebase Titan was silent. Marines cleaned weapons, checked equipment, stared at nothing. Blake sat in the command seat and filed her after-action report in her head, knowing every word would be scrutinized by people who'd never set foot on a frozen moon, who'd never lost Marines under their command. She didn't care. The memorial service was held at dawn, when the binary stars rose together and painted the ice in shades of gold and pink. The entire company assembled in the firebase courtyard, dress uniforms perfect. 5 boots stood in a line, 5 rifles inverted behind them, 5 helmets resting on top. Hayes, Miller, Rodriguez, O'Brien, Tran. The names were etched on plaques at each station, along with their ranks, and the only epitaph that mattered: died in defense of the innocent. The Caleri survivors stood to one side, their skin markings pulsing in patterns Blake's translator said meant grief and honor and debt unpayable. The elder who'd testified in the briefing room approached each station, touching the helmets with all 4 hands, whispering something in her own language that the translators couldn't render. Blake read the names aloud, her voice carrying in the cold air. She spoke of courage and sacrifice, of duty and honor, of 5 Marines who'd seen civilians in danger and chosen to stand between them and death. She spoke of the cost of that choice, and she did not shy from naming it high. "We are Colonial Marines," Blake said, facing the assembled company. "We go where others cannot. We stand where others will not. We fight so that innocence can live, so that families can sleep safely, so that civilization can exist in the dark between stars." She looked at the 5 memorials, at the faces of her remaining Marines, at the Caleri who owed their lives to human courage. Second Squad paid that price in full. They are gone, but they are not forgotten. Their names will be remembered. Their sacrifice will be honored. And anyone who threatens those under our protection will learn what Marines taught the Rathic Dominion. Blake's voice dropped to something quiet and hard. "The stars don't forgive. Neither do we." The company fired a 3-volley salute, the crack of rifles echoing off the ice. The Caleri sang something in their own language, high and keening and beautiful. Taps played over the speakers, the notes hanging in the frozen air like tears. Blake stood at attention through all of it, her face expressionless, her grief locked away where Marines learned to keep it. There would be time later for the weight of it, for the names that would haunt her quiet moments, for the letters to families that would say sorry and honored and not remotely enough. But not now. Now she had a company to lead, a mission to continue, and a promise to keep. The memorial service ended, Marines dispersed to their duties. The Caleri survivors were loaded onto transport for evacuation to a safer settlement. Life at Firebase Titan continued, because life always continued, even when parts of you stayed behind on frozen ground with the friends you couldn't save. Blake returned to her office and filed her official after-action report. She described the assault on the Rathic facility in clinical terms, emphasizing tactical necessity and proportional response. She omitted the rage, the cold satisfaction of watching enemies die, the terrible joy of taking payment in blood. Those things didn't belong in official reports. 3 days later, the response came from regimental command. Blake read it in her office, alone, and allowed herself a small smile. Captain Blake commended for decisive action for the defense of civilian population and subsequent neutralization of threats, demonstrated the highest traditions of Colonial Marines. Second Squad, 2nd Platoon, Charlie Company awarded Colonial Star posthumously. Their sacrifice will not be forgotten. Blake printed the message and added it to the company memorial wall right beneath the names. Hayes, Miller, Rodriguez, O'Brien, Tran. 5 Marines who'd held the line when the line needed holding, who'd made the hard choice when the hard choice was the only one. She stood before the wall for a long moment, thinking about the weight of command, the price of protection. The math that said 5 lives for 9 was acceptable when the alternative was 14 dead. She thought about the Rathic facility burning, about justice and vengeance, and whether there was really a difference when your friends were dead. In the end, Blake decided it didn't matter. The Rathic had learned their lesson, the Caleri were safe, 2nd Squad had done their job, that was enough. Blake turned from the memorial wall and walked back to her office. There were patrols to schedule, reports to file, a company to run. The war hadn't ended, it never did, not really. There would be more threats, more missions, more times when Marines would have to stand between civilians and death. But that was tomorrow's problem. Today, she had a company that had just reminded the galaxy why you didn't mess with human protectorates, and Marines who understood that the price of protection was sometimes paid in blood. The Caleri elder sent a message before her ship departed. Blake read it at her desk, the translated words glowing on her screen. Your warriors saved us when they had every reason to run. They fought when they could have hidden. They died so we could live. The Caleri people will remember 2nd Squad. We will tell our children their names. We will honor their sacrifice across all generations. Thank you for sending us heroes. Blake saved the message in her personal files, one more piece of weight to carry forward. Then she stood, straightened her uniform, and walked out into the firebase where her Marines were training, preparing, readying themselves for whatever came next. The binary stars shone overhead, cold and bright and uncaring. The ice reflected their light in patterns that could be beautiful if you didn't know how many had died on this frozen ground. The wind carried the smell of propellant and recycled air, and the thousand other scents that meant human presence in hostile territory. Blake took it in and felt something settle in her chest. This was the job, this was the mission. This was what it meant to be a colonial marine, to stand watch in the dark places, to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, to pay the price when payment was demanded. Second Squad had paid in full. The Rathic had learned the cost of miscalculation. The Caleri survivors would carry the story forward, would speak the names of 5 humans who'd chosen sacrifice over survival. And somewhere in the galaxy, on Earth or another colony or a ship between stars, families would receive letters that started with "We regret to inform you" and ended with the highest traditions of service, and said nothing at all about what it meant to die on a frozen moon. Fighting for strangers, believing that the fight mattered. Blake hoped they'd understand. She hoped they'd be proud. She hoped they'd know that their sons and daughters and siblings had been heroes in every way that mattered. But hope was a luxury. Certainty was what Marines dealt in, and Blake was certain of only one thing. When the Rathic Dominion or anyone else looked at humanity and wondered if they could be pushed, if they could be cowed, if their protection was worth testing, they'd remember Outpost 7. They'd remember 5 Marines who'd held the line. They'd remember that the stars don't forgive, and neither do we.